Hey peeps, welcome back to your favorite chronic illness podcast. If you notice the silence, guess what? It was intentional, alright? After pushing through 13 episodes, teaching and reformatting a course on kidney health, and then managing the recovery from a renal stent exchange, I finally hit a wall. The weather changed on me, the meteoropathy kicked in, and I just had to hit pause. I had to just halt everything and pause for a second. But here's what's interesting. What I notice is that when the pace stops, the processing tends to begin. When those urgent appointments disappear and the body finally gets a chance to rest for a little bit, that's when the mind starts to catch up to everything it just witnessed. Yeah, today I'm pulling back the curtain on my own quiet period. We're talking about the unexpected emotional work that comes after the medical crisis. The grief, the reflection, and the struggle to align this new reality into a life that was constantly on the move. Yeah, I'm going to be vulnerable on this one. So sit back as we unpack all of this. Let's get into it.
I didn't have the strength that I have now. That's when you really need people.
People who could understand.
It really did make a difference.
So finding that community, finding that tribe.
Or in that realm of chronic illness and stuff.
I barely go through it because I'd be so focused.
Never thought in a million years that would have to happen to me.
All those emotions are valid. Every last one of them.
I was at a low point.
Just kind of removing the stigma.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Chronic Brew. Yo, I don't know what it is about this new intro, but every single time I hear it, I get so hyped. Like I'm geeking right now. But let me calm down. Welcome back to the Chronic Brew, everyone. I'm your host, Mr. Cool Beans, and if you're joining us after our 3-week break, welcome back. If you're new here, know that this is a space for honest, unfiltered conversations about life with chronic illness, okay? Usually I have an incredible guest with me, but today it's just me. All right? And honestly, I needed this time to just process. If you caught the opening, you know why I'm sitting here alone today. It's been 3 weeks, and honestly, the silence after pushing through the teaching, the episodes, the renal stent exchange, and even the meteoropathy, it's been super deafening. All right, the urgent medical drama is over, but that emotional backlog, trust me, it's just hitting. Today, we're not talking about symptoms. All right, we're talking about the aftermath. We're going to be exploring the strange, quiet period where the body starts to mend, but your mind is still scrambling to process the trauma that it just went through. We're looking at the unexpected wave of grief that follows the relief, and how you can start the difficult work of integrating a crisis into your identity. Yeah, it's time for the mental recovery to begin. So let's start with this. Think about your own medical crisis and what you went through. What was the immediate feeling when the treatment schedule stopped and the medical urgency disappeared? Was it relief? Or was it something much more jarring? Let's put everything into perspective for me. So, here we are. It's been 3 weeks since the last episode, and frankly, I needed that break. And as many of you know, the past few months have been a complete sprint for me. We hit the 13th episode, I was running the CKD 101 course, and then right in the middle of all that, I had to manage the recovery of a renal stent exchange. On top of everything, the weather was shifting, and anyone who deals with meteoropathy knows that alone is enough to bring you to your knees, okay? It was like a period of constant doing, constant managing, and even constant, pushing. But here's the thing about operating on crisis mode. You don't realize how much adrenaline and I would say sheer willpower you're relying on until it's completely gone. The stent exchange felt like the finish line of that acute phase, if you will. Once it was done, the doctors left. The urgent appointment stopped and the schedule went completely silent. And that silence right there, that's the part that was jarring. I didn't get the relief I expected. I thought I'd collapse into bed and wake up feeling, mentally lighter. Instead, though, I felt a strange kind of empty when the medical urgency wasn't there anymore. It's like a feeling of abandonment. Kind of like the feeling like I was driving a car at 100 miles an hour and then suddenly slammed the brakes. The car stops, but your body keeps going, right? Your inertia, slams you into your seatbelt. And that's what this period felt like to me. My body had stopped, but my internal system, my emotional and my mental wiring was still revving at crisis speed. There was no gentle coasting. It was an abrupt, emotional thud, if you will. The chaos, of the past few months was a weird kind of comfort. It gave me a clear enemy and a clear schedule. My job was just to execute. Now my job is to be. And I realized that I had forgotten how to just be. I think the biggest struggle with chronic illness isn't always the crisis itself, but the shock, of the standstill afterwards. You have that urgency. The urgency is a powerful distraction at times. When the distraction leaves you, you're left, staring at the wreckage, the emergency left behind. For me, the first emotional reaction when the urgency was over wasn't peace. Yeah, it wasn't peace. It was a bizarre mix of anxiety and heavy weighted fatigue that had nothing to do with sleep. It was a feeling of, what do I do now? What's the next thing? Because I had forgotten how to just exist without a major deadline or procedure looming. For the longest time, I felt like the silence was a failure. Like, if I wasn't running myself ragged, producing, teaching, getting the next test done, I wasn't managing my illness correctly. But you know what? Just sitting here now in the stillness, I realized the shock of the stop wasn't about the procedure ending. It was about the shock of facing myself without a task to hide behind. It was realizing how desperately I needed the noise to avoid confronting how scared I actually was through all of this. Like looking yourself in the mirror and asking yourself those deep questions like, who am I after all of this? Yeah. Once that external noise stopped, that's when that internal noise started. And I almost kind of favor it to being like emotional backlog. Where the trauma you thought you handled, finally catches up to you. One of the biggest things that I've realized in those intense months of, trying to podcast and teach and prepare for the surgery is that, my body was in survival mode because I kept staying busy. Your brain is only focused on the next task during those times, get the script done, get to the appointment, survive the procedure, there is simply no available mental real estate for processing emotion. But when the silent hits you though, the doors swing wide open and all that emotion, the stuff that you conveniently kind of packed neatly and shoved into your mental closet, you compartmentalized it. Yeah, those come flooding out like nobody's business. I almost liken it unto like a big glass of water that just kept dripping and dripping over time, and now it's full and about to tip over. And I know if it falls, it's gonna make a mess everywhere. Okay, this is the emotional backlog that I was talking about. It can feel overwhelming because it's not just one big feeling, it's thousands of small ones. For me, it wasn't the big traumatic moments that hit first. All right, it was like the small, almost insignificant things. I suddenly kept thinking about the moment right before the surgery when I tried to look brave and felt physically nervous, or I keep replaying the constant crushing fatigue of that awful meteoropathy, that chronic fatigue. Hey, look, chronic fatigue, it's no joke, guys. Or even, that hopelessness of knowing the weather was, sinking my health while I was standing to teach the class. In the quiet, these minor moments feel magnificent because they're the raw, undeniable proof of how much stress and pain I was actually under. In the rush, you just label it, a bad day. But in the quiet, though, you realize that it was trauma. And you want to know what's even more crazier? It's like underneath all of those small moments is the undeniable presence of grief. Okay? We often only associate grief with the final loss, like death. But living with chronic illness means experiencing continuous layered losses. You grieve the life you could have had without the illness, and you grieve the moments the illness stole. In this quiet period for me, the grief I'm feeling is pretty much multifaceted. I grieve the loss of time and capacity, which pretty much is mourning the weeks that I've spent merely surviving instead of living, or even just being fully present with loved ones. And recognizing the limitation that this has imposed on my capacity to move forward. I also grieve for the healthy me narrative. The painful confrontation that this procedure, the stent exchange and the meteoropathy, all of that means that my body requires constant invasive intervention. It's a confrontation with my body's vulnerability. And then, I also grieve, in ways where I show anger and frustration sometimes. I'll be honest, I'm not perfect. I think the anger and frustration comes from feeling bitter about the unfairness of having to, just constantly fight for basic function while watching others coast through life and, through changing seasons. And the biggest revelation in this phase is how difficult it is to live with two competing realities. The external reality says, your surgery's over, you're fixed, be relieved. And then the internal reality says, you're traumatized, you're sad, you need to mourn. I think the key question in this phase is, what specific memory from the frantic schedule keeps resurfacing now, that I have the space, and why does it feel so heavy right now? It's only by identifying those specific emotional triggers that you can truly start the work of processing and move through them. If I'm being truly honest, if I'm being honest about the emotional backlog, it feels less like processing and more like drowning. I spent months being proud of how fine I was, how I juggled the teaching, the podcast, and the stent exchange without a complaint. But now, my mind is essentially saying, you lied to me. You pretended everything was manageable, and now we have to deal with, the debt. The grief isn't a single wave, if I'm being honest. It's constant. It's churning. It's the sadness, it's the anger, it's the terrifying realization that my body went through something, far more traumatic than I would ever allow myself to acknowledge in a moment. It's messy. It's not neat. It's the hardest work I've faced. Acknowledging, this emotional backlog is just the first step though. The next and perhaps the most challenging step is figuring out, what this crisis means for the person that I am now. And not just for the person that I am now, but how this experience impacts my long-term identity and my relationship with my own body. Any medical crisis can force us all into survival mode. Let's be honest. We become the fighter, the manager, the one who gets it done. That persona is powerful, don't get me wrong, but it is a shield. When the crisis subsides, we're left to pick up the pieces of our regular self. And I think the critical question emerges. Is that regular self still whole? For me, I think back to the partial nephrectomy and how painful it was. And it was pretty much a huge reminder that my body is now vulnerable. The logical part of my brain knows that the surgery was a technical fix, a survival tactic that worked, if you will. But the emotional part, the part that is processing now, it asks, why did my body need the fixing in the first place? Or even, why is my body the constant problem? This creates that profound internal tension. You have to pretty much reconcile the body that endured and survived the major surgery, with the body that in some fundamental way failed and needed that intervention in the first place. Listen, we can't just go back to being pre-CKD stage 4 or pre-medical crisis, okay? We have to accept that both realities, the chronic illness and the resilience, the failure and the survival, are now a permanent integrated part of the story. This isn't just a physical change. It's a fundamental shift in my personal narrative, okay? This shift changes everything, especially how I define strength, because I'll be honest, before this, I might have defined strength as, pushing through the chronic fatigue and the meteoropathy, or pushing through the pain to record that 13th episode because I got this, I'm strong, I can, all that stuff. I saw my value in my capacity to overcome my body. But sitting right here in the stillness, I realized that my true resilience is actually found in pausing. It's found in accepting the vulnerability and saying, I need 3 weeks off, and honestly, that's a win for my long-term survival, okay? It's realizing that the heroic act isn't a sustainable sprint. It's that radical honesty required to just slow all the way down. The key question in this phase is, how does having gone through this acute crisis change your definition of strength and your relationship with your own body? And for me, the answer is shifting from beating the body into submission to partnering with it. I am actively letting go of the anger that my body betrayed me. I'm replacing it with a cautious sense of gratitude for its ability to fight and heal, even when it needs a stent exchange to help it along the way. This means treating it more gently, acknowledging its incredible power to survive and respecting its very real, non-negotiable limitations. Disintegration of the traumatic memory is the only way to move forward without constantly living in fear for the next crisis lurking around the corner. And who knows what that'll be. you know, this is the hardest work because it requires rewriting the story of who you are at your own core. But without it, you simply become a spectator to your own life, waiting for the next medical drama. And trust me, you don't want that. The toughest realization in this phase has been admitting that my definition of strength was actually toxic. I thought strength meant, being a hero who fought the renal procedures and, taught the kidney core simultaneously. But now I look back and see that, that was just self-abandonment. My new strength isn't about pushing my body. It's about the terrifying vulnerability of listening to it. When I look in the mirror, I see a body that is fundamentally changed and perhaps a bit broken. But I also see one that is fiercely resilient. Not because it endured the crisis and all that, but because it finally demanded I slow down and learn to be its partner. Acknowledging this new partnership is the foundation for recovery. I had to swallow that pill. In our final phase, we'll move from this, abstract identity working to tangible action, setting the compass for mental recovery and sharing the small, gentle commitments that will guide us forward into the quiet period. Peeps, before I even move on, I gotta say, man, one of the biggest reasons why I enjoy doing the Chronic Brew is because it allows me to be free in my thoughts and it allows me to be vulnerable without a lot of people around. And you guys get front row and center and all of that. I don't think I've ever done this in front of anybody, but I'm glad that you're listening because, even on this episode here, we've covered the shock of, me stopping, pausing everything, the depth of the grief that I feel from time to time because of the lack of busyness, if you will. And even, the challenging work of, integrating the trauma into a new sense of identity. I think before we close this off, we definitely need to define what the next phase or the next steps look like for me as far as recovery. And that's the mental recovery part. It's definitely absolutely tempting to believe that, once the physical crisis, the surgeries, all of that stuff stops, it's over. You're healed. We're conditioned to see a procedure as a finish line. Let's keep it a stack. But as we've discussed, the emotional and mental debt is real. And it won't be paid off with a single night's sleep, all right? Like sleep works for folks with chronic illness anyway. The mental recovery must be treated as its own, distinct and non-negotiable phase of healing, all right? Just as important as the physical one. This is not a phase for grand, ambitious goals, all right? I say that so strongly because I am guilty of this. This is a phase for gentle commitments, and maybe sometimes I just don't know how to be gentle with myself. Commitments, I gotta do commitments that acknowledge, the exhaustion of the past few months. I've identified two small but vital things, that I'm prioritizing during this stillness. The first one I'm acknowledging is establishing that no crisis zone, okay? For me, this is a commitment to deliberately dismantle the trauma response my brain tries to build up, okay? I can be my own self-critic. Pretty much it means actively building a small, rigid block of time each day, aiming for about, 15 minutes, where I'm literally not allowed to think about my symptoms, appointments, or work deadlines, okay? It's just a rest period, and I need that, it's an act of resistance, it's a deliberate fencing off space for simple being. Watching a bird, holding a warm mug of coffee or maybe just tea because I know my nephrologist is listening, staring at the ceiling. The goal is to practice peace, not just wait for it to arrive, thereby teaching my mind that the acute crisis is over. You can finally stand down now. Please chill out, relax. It's okay, breathe. I'm creating proof that survival is possible even when I'm not fighting. The second part is, externalizing the emotional backlog with ritual. I realized that the grief and anxiety from the surgeries and, just having CKD in and of itself were so heavy because I was carrying it all internally. I have my caregiver, my wife, she's super supportive. My son Brian, who always tries to spark smiles on me, but I carried so much of my hurt and my burden inside that I try not to let them see it. But carrying all of that is painful, especially for me because of that emotional backlog. My commitment is to spend at least 5 minutes every morning journaling. If I'm not journaling, I get to have some, out loud thinking, but with specific rules. 0 editing and 0 judgment. The goal is not to craft a beautiful speech or poem and to solve the feeling, but to simply give the emotion a place to live outside of my head. I'm literally transferring the anger about the meteoropathy and the fear about the next procedure onto paper. This makes the heavy, messy work of phase 2 manageable because I can literally close the journal and say, that feeling's noted. I don't have to carry it all day. If you're listening to this, in your own quiet period, after surgery, after a major flare, or just after a sprint of your own, I want you to take one single powerful message away from my experience. Your mental recovery is not a luxury. Okay, it's the ultimate form of self-preservation. It's just something that I've said before on previous episodes. You were strong enough to survive this crisis. Now, you must be brave enough to process it. Don't waste the stillness by filling it with new noise, okay, new anxieties or new tasks. Please don't. Prioritize your stillness because this is where true lasting healing really begins. That chaos of the past few months for me is gone. The heavy processing of the trauma is now in motion. And now we move forward, not with a sprint, okay? We're not trying to, kill ourselves, but with a deliberate, grateful, and much more slower walk toward a more, I would say, integrated self. After all this time spent in the stillness, my ultimate commitment is simple. I will no longer confuse my resilience with invincibility. The busy of the past few months, the surgical procedures, even the battling of meteoropathy right now, that all proved I'm resilient, It also proved that I'm human and profoundly finite. This quiet is now my non-negotiable proof that I value my life more than I value the capacity to perform. My mental recovery isn't a goal. It's the new, quiet, non-negotiable minimum requirement for my long-term survival. I hope all of this really does give you permission to just be gentle with yourself in your own stillness. And peeps, with that, we've reached the end of this very short and incredibly personal episode of the Chronic Brew podcast. Listen, I had to keep it short. I mean, if I'm going to talk all that jazz about recovery and, taking care of myself, I had to make sure I'm putting it into practice. So it had to be short. All right. So chill out. First of all, I just want to thank you for sitting with me in the stillness and for allowing me the space to process the shock, the grief, and the deep emotional work that follows a medical crisis and a busy season. I hope that, even by opening up my door to my quiet period, you feel permission to honor yours. Don't rush the necessary work of letting your mind catch up. Be honest about the emotional debt, no matter how heavy it is or how expensive, and be ridiculously gentle with yourself as you pay it back. Okay? My final thought after all of this, all this processing is simple. You were strong enough for the fight. You are worthy enough for the rest. Take that with you. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next time on the Chronic Brew podcast. Peace.